Chapter 1. The First Trick. The night was young, and the city was alive with possibilities. Neon lights flickered across the glass buildings, casting a dazzling glow on the streets below. Somewhere in the heart of this chaotic metropolis, a performance was about to begin, one that would leave the world reeling. This was no ordinary show. It was a spectacle, a heist disguised as a magic act, and it would change everything. In the crowded theater, a hush fell over the audience. All eyes were fixed on the stage, where four figures stood, draped in dark cloaks, their faces hidden behind the shadows. The buzz of excitement was palpable as whispers passed from person to person. The Four Horsemen, they were called. But no one truly knew their names. They had become legends, leaving a trail of confusion and awe in their wake. At the center of the stage stood the leader, a man with an air of mystery about him. He was known only as the Illusionist, his true identity hidden from the public eye. His voice was smooth and charismatic, carrying an undeniable confidence. "Tonight, we will show you what it means to believe," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What it means to see beyond the ordinary, to witness something truly extraordinary. But beware, what you see may not be what you believe." The audience leaned in, captivated. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a flourish, the illusionist raised his hand, and the lights dimmed to a near blackness. Only a single spotlight illuminated the stage, casting long shadows on the floor. Without warning, a burst of color erupted from the shadows. Cards, thousands of them, rained down from the ceiling. The audience gasped as the colorful cards floated gracefully through the air, defying gravity, swirling around the room like confetti. As they drifted, they seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. The trick was impossible. No one could perform such a feat, but the illusionist wasn't done. With a snap of his fingers, the cards vanished. And in their place stood an enormous, glittering vault. The crowd's collective breath caught in their throats. It was the vault from the highest security bank in the city, the one that had been rumored to be impenetrable, unreachable. But there it stood, open for all to see. The illusionist stepped forward, his face now illuminated by the spotlight. "You're probably wondering how this is possible. How did we do this?" He paused, a smirk forming on his lips. "It's simple. Magic, or rather, something much greater than that." The lights flashed again, and when they returned to normal, the illusionist and the vault had disappeared. The audience erupted into applause, but it was a nervous, confused applause. They had just witnessed something impossible, something that defied every law of physics they knew. Chapter 2. Behind the Curtain. Miles away, in a dark alley, the illusionist and his team sat in a dimly lit room, far from the glitzy glamour of the theater. They had successfully pulled off the trick, but that was only the beginning. There was something bigger at play here, something they couldn't ignore. "The vault's not just a trick," said the magician, a woman with fiery red hair and an intellect that could match any top strategist. "It's a message. And I think they've seen it." The con man, a smooth talker with a knack for persuasion, leaned forward. "You're right. We gave them a glimpse of what we can do, but now we need to make sure they don't figure out the secret too soon." The fourth member of the group, the pickpocket, was silent as usual, her sharp eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. Her skills were unmatched when it came to stealth and infiltration. But she, like the others, knew that their biggest trick had yet to come. "Tonight, we show them magic," the illusionist said, his voice calm and steady. "But the real magic? That's going to take more than tricks. We've got a plan, and we're going to make history." As the team prepared for their next move, one thing was certain: they were playing a game bigger than anything they'd ever imagined. The stakes were high, the risks greater than ever, but so were the rewards. Their next act would not only challenge the audience's perception of reality, but would shake the very foundations of power and influence in the city. The horsemen weren't just performers, they were the new architects of fate. And this was only the beginning of their journey. Chapter 3: The Heist Begins. The city had always been a playground for the rich and powerful, but now, the Four Horsemen had found a way to play the game on their own terms. They weren't just taking money, they were taking control. With the vault stunt already behind them, the illusion had created a buzz, a whirlpool of curiosity and disbelief. But it was time for them to move beyond simple magic tricks. The real challenge was ahead. It had all started with a plan, a meticulous, well-thought-out scheme to expose the true puppet masters who controlled the financial empire of the city. These were people who thought they were untouchable. The Four Horsemen were about to prove them wrong. The target was a high-profile financial magnate named Robert Sullivan, a man whose wealth and influence reached into every corner of the world's markets. His private security was legendary, and his vaults were said to be impenetrable. But that didn't matter to the illusionist. For him, a challenge was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved. He stood in front of a massive screen, the map of Sullivan's estate filling the room. A series of complex blueprints highlighted everything from the security systems to the vault layout, but the illusionist had a deeper focus, something more than just the physical systems. He had studied Sullivan, his habits, his personality. He knew that the real trick wasn't in bypassing the security, but in getting inside Sullivan's mind. The magician sat nearby, tapping her fingers on the table as she observed the map. We'll need to make this feel like a simple illusion. It's not about getting inside the vault. It's about making him believe he's already lost. The con man smiled, a grin that always made the others uneasy. You know, that's exactly why you're the mastermind. We're going to mess with his perception. Let him see the vault open, let him believe the money is gone. The illusionist nodded. It's all about the illusion. People are ruled by what they believe, not by what's real. Once we get inside his head, we control the game. Their plan was simple, yet brilliant. They would infiltrate Sullivan's estate during a grand gala, a charity event meant to showcase his immense wealth. The horsemen would pose as performers, blending in with the elite, and then, under the guise of a show, they would pull off the biggest heist in history. Chapter 4: The Gala. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. The sound of champagne glasses clinking and laughter filled the air. Sullivan was the star of the evening, of course, as he always was. His arrogance was palpable as he moved through the room, flanked by bodyguards and the city's most influential figures. But for the Four Horsemen, the gala was just a backdrop. They weren't interested in the fancy clothes or the high society. They were interested in Sullivan's vault. The magician had already made her move, slipping into the VIP section where Sullivan was holding court. Her charm was undeniable, and soon, she was engaged in a conversation with the magnate himself, her every word carefully calculated to create just the right level of intrigue. Meanwhile, the pickpocket had already slipped past the security detail, her small frame easily disappearing into the crowd. She was making her way toward the private elevator that led to Sullivan's vault, carefully avoiding the gaze of the ever-watchful guards. Her mind was sharp, every step calculated, and her heart raced with excitement. As for the illusionist and the con man, they were putting on their own show. Disguised as magicians, they began performing for the guests. Their tricks were subtle, impressive, but most importantly, they were distractions. The horsemen knew that the gala's guests were easily swept away by the glitz and glamour, and all it took was a few moments of misdirection to create chaos. With each trick, the audience's focus drifted away from Sullivan's vault and onto the performers. It was exactly what they needed. The trick wasn't just about stealing the money, it was about pulling the wool over Sullivan's eyes. He would think he was in control, but in truth, he was already a pawn in their game. As the night wore on, the tension grew. Everything was falling into place. The pickpocket had made it to the elevator shaft, and the magician was now working on Sullivan's mind, planting subtle doubts about the safety of his vault. The others were ready, waiting for the signal. Then came the moment. The illusionist stepped forward, calling for the grand finale. "Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest illusion you will ever witness," he declared, his voice commanding the room. "Tonight, we're not just performing for your entertainment. Tonight, we're going to change the way you see the world." He raised his hands, and the lights dimmed again. The stage was set. All eyes were on him. Chapter 5: The Great Vanishing. As the room fell into darkness, the horseman's final trick began. In the center of the stage, a massive steel safe materialized out of thin air. The audience gasped, the sound of their awe almost deafening. The illusionist approached the vault, his movements deliberate, calculated. "This is no ordinary vault," he said. "In fact, it's not a vault at all." He raised his hand, and the safe's door slowly began to open. Inside, it was empty. Sullivan's heart skipped a beat. He had seen the vault with his own eyes. How could it be empty? The answer was simple. The money wasn't missing. It was never there in the first place. But the illusion was perfect. In that moment, Sullivan felt the weight of his own empire begin to crumble. The money, the power, the control, all of it was an illusion. The Four Horsemen hadn't taken his wealth. They had taken his perception. Chapter 6: The Revelation. The applause that followed the vanishing vault was deafening. The audience was caught in a mix of awe and confusion, trying to process what they had just seen. The illusionist stood at the center of the stage, arms raised in triumph, his eyes scanning the room as the world's most powerful people applauded blindly, unaware that they had just been manipulated in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. But Sullivan, in the back of the room, stood frozen, his expression darkening with every passing second. He had seen the vault. He had been in control until now. His mind raced, trying to piece together how it could have happened. How had the money disappeared? Where had it gone? He turned to his head of security, a large, imposing man named Mark, who stood by his side, equally stunned. "How?" Sullivan's voice trembled, betraying the fear that was beginning to set in. I don't know, sir," Mark stammered, his eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of the culprits. But there was no sign of the illusionist or the rest of his team. They had already disappeared into the crowd, their performance finished. The horsemen had given them just enough to create the illusion of magic, but the true magic was in the mystery they left behind. As Sullivan's mind raced, the illusionist watched from the shadows, his gaze unwavering. Sullivan wasn't the only one who had been fooled. The horsemen had pulled off their greatest trick yet, not just a heist, but a challenge to the very idea of power and control. The city's elite had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. And that was exactly the point. "Now we move," the illusionist whispered to his team, who had regrouped backstage. "It's time to show them what happens when you think you can control everything." Chapter 7: Playing the Game. Back in the shadows of Sullivan's estate, the horsemen prepared for the next phase of their plan. They had already shattered his perception of safety, but now they needed to make their next move. And it had to be precise. "The vault's only the beginning," the magician said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "Sullivan doesn't know it yet, but we've already planted the seeds for his downfall. It's not about the money, it's about the power. We're taking away his greatest asset, his belief in his own invincibility." The con man leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed. "You're right. The illusion isn't about pulling off a trick, it's about making them believe they're in control when they're not. This city is full of people who think they hold all the cards, but we're the ones reshuffling the deck." The pickpockets stood by the window, looking out into the night. They're already talking about the vault. The words spreading like wildfire. Sullivan is going to be paranoid, but that's exactly what we need. We need him distracted. "Distraction is just the beginning," the illusionist replied. "We've made him feel vulnerable, and that's when we strike." Chapter 8. The Fall. The next morning, Sullivan's world began to unravel. News outlets were buzzing with rumors about the gala's magic performance. Headlines screamed about the vanishing vault, about the impossible heist. And all the while, Sullivan's name was being whispered in hushed tones, accompanied by phrases like untrustworthy and vulnerable. Sullivan's empire, built on years of manipulation and control, had suddenly started to feel shaky. Every meeting, every phone call, every interaction was filled with tension. His closest advisors were becoming increasingly worried, their confidence in his leadership waning. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to sprout. Meanwhile, the illusionist and his team were watching from a safe distance. Their next move was already in play. They had made sure the media had picked up on the event, ensuring that the whispers about Sullivan's vulnerability would reach the ears of every powerful person in the city. As the days passed, Sullivan found himself in a game he no longer understood. The Horsemen weren't interested in stealing his wealth. They weren't even interested in taking his power. No, they wanted something deeper, something more fundamental. They wanted to expose the truth that power, in all its forms, was just another illusion. Sullivan's empire, once unshakable, was now on the verge of collapse. His closest allies began pulling away from him, unsure if they could trust him after what had happened. And in the midst of it all, Sullivan remained oblivious to the full scope of the Horsemen's plan. Chapter 9. The Final Act. The Culmination of the Horse Plan was coming to fruition. They had systematically undermined Sullivan's empire, piece by piece, using his own sense of control against him. The media had already turned against him, and now the final blow was about to be dealt. The illusionists knew that the time for subtlety was over. They needed to make a statement, one that would send shockwaves through the city and beyond. They had already shown that magic was a tool for deception. Now, they would use it to expose the lies that held the city's power structure together. It was time for the final act. In a bold move, the illusionist called a press conference. The world's eyes were on him as he stood in front of a room full of journalists, his team hidden in the crowd. "We've come here today," the illusionist began, his voice steady, not to perform another illusion, but to reveal the truth. For years, the people of this city have been led to believe that their wealth, their power, is something earned. But what if I told you that everything you know is an illusion? That the power you cling to is nothing more than a carefully constructed lie? The reporters looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. But the illusionist continued undeterred. "Tonight, we show you the truth behind the illusion. And when we do, you'll see that the real power has always been in your hands." And just like that, the game was over. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The fallout from the illusionist's press conference was immediate. Sullivan's empire crumbled in the span of a few days. His influence disappeared as quickly as it had risen, and the city watched as the once unbeatable mogul fell from grace. The Horsemen had not only robbed him of his wealth, they had robbed him of his belief in himself, his belief that he could control everything around him. As for the Horsemen, they vanished into the shadows, their mission complete. They hadn't just pulled off the perfect heist. They had reshaped the very foundations of power in the city. But no one would ever truly know who they were or what they had done. They were the masters of illusion, the architects of fate, and they had made the world believe in magic. Chapter 11. The Final Trick Extended. The city had moved on from the spectacle of the Horsemen, but the shadow of their heist still loomed large. The grand illusion they had pulled off, revealing the fragility of power and exposing the lies that upheld an empire, had left an indelible mark on the world. Yet, for the illusionist and his team, the aftermath was a strange quiet. The illusionist found himself alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of their actions pressing on his shoulders. He sat at a small desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes staring absently at the reflection in the mirror. The walls around him seemed to close in, as though the very air was thick with the consequences of their actions. The buzz of the city outside was distant now, muffled by the glass and concrete walls, but still, he felt it, the world moving forward, unaware that it had been irrevocably changed. The horsemen had made history, but had they changed anything for the better? Or had they merely pulled off a dazzling trick that would eventually fade into nothingness? Is this what victory feels like? The illusionist whispered to himself, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Because it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a hollow echo. He had been the architect of the plan, the one who pulled the strings behind the scenes. But now that Sullivan was gone, his empire shattered, what had they truly accomplished? He had dismantled a system, a symbol of power, but what remained? Who were they now? The sound of footsteps echoed softly behind him, breaking his brooding thoughts. The magician entered the room with her usual quiet grace, her fiery red hair gleaming in the dim light. Her expression was calm, yet there was something in her eyes that conveyed understanding. She had always been the one to see through the illusions, both of magic and of life. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of curiosity. The illusionist let out a long, drawn-out sigh, placing his glass on the desk. He looked at her, his eyes searching for answers. "We won. We took him down. But I can't shake the feeling that it's all for nothing." The magician walked over and sat across from him, her sharp gaze never leaving his. "You're asking yourself the wrong question," she said softly. "It was never about Sullivan. It was never about the money or the vault. It was about the system. About the illusion of control that people like him build around themselves. And we did what we set out to do." He leaned back in his chair, staring at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "But what now? The city will forget. The people will move on, and will fade into myth. That's what happens to all illusions, isn't it? They disappear." "No," she replied, her voice firm. "What we've done is much bigger than that. We've cracked the foundation of a system built on lies, and now the world sees it. The people will never look at power the same way again. Our actions have already planted seeds of doubt, and once those seeds grow, the world will change. It may take time, but it will change." Her words lingered in the air, but the illusionist couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that gnawed at him. He had orchestrated the downfall of a powerful man, but now he was unsure of his place in this new world they had helped create. They had exposed the truth, but was that enough? "I feel like we've opened a door, but I don't know what's on the other side," he confessed, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The magician smiled knowingly, her eyes softening. "That's the thing about illusions, isn't it? Once you see the truth, it's impossible to go back. You can't unsee what you've learned. You've given the world a glimpse of what lies beneath the surface, and they can't ignore it now." He nodded slowly, understanding her point. But still, the doubt lingered. They had done what they set out to do, but what did it really mean? Had they truly changed anything, or had they simply left a trail of destruction in their wake? As if reading his thoughts, the magician leaned forward, her tone serious. "We didn't just take down Sullivan. We took down the very idea of power as they know it. We've shown them that power isn't something you can hold in your hands, it's something you create in the minds of others. And we created something greater than just an illusion. We created the foundation for something new." Epilogue: The next illusion. Months passed since Sullivan's fall, and the city slowly began to rebuild. But the effects of the horsemen's actions were still felt everywhere. The cracks in the power structure had grown wider, and though the media had moved on to the next headline, whispers of the horsemen's heist, the vanishing vault, the impossible magic, lingered in the background, fueling an undercurrent of unrest. Sullivan's empire had crumbled, But that wasn't the end of the story. The horsemen had accomplished something far more significant than taking down one man. They had given the world a new lens through which to view the world. The illusion of invincibility, of unassailable power, had been shattered. People no longer accepted the idea that wealth and influence were enough to guarantee control. But for the illusionist and his team, the world was still in flux. The aftermath of their actions had created something new, something unpredictable. They had opened a door, but they weren't sure where it led. The illusionist stood before a large map spread out on the table, his fingers tracing lines across the world. This wasn't just a map of cities and countries, it was a map of possibilities. Each line was a potential path, each dot a new target. Their game wasn't over. It had just changed. "The illusion we created," the illusionist said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is only the beginning. We've shown them that they can be controlled by something as fragile as belief. Now, it's time to take it further." The magician stood beside him, her eyes scanning the map as well. "Where do we go from here?" He looked up at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "The world is full of illusions. Let's go find the next one." And with that, the horsemen stepped into the shadows once again, ready to reshape the world in their image.